For 35 years, one door in the watch industry stayed shut to China. Then, in April 2026 inches, Geneva, it opened for a 48-person workshop out of Shenzhen most of the world had never heard of. Nobody expected what happened next. The Room. On the 14th of April 2026 in Palexpo, Geneva, 66 brands set up inside those halls for Watches and Wonders. The 1 week a year, the entire watch industry decides what counts as serious. Rolex is here. Patek Philippe is here. So is Audemars Piguet, back for the first time since 2019, filling a booth like it never left. Palexpo in April smells like every trade show does underneath the polish. Fresh carpet glue, cold air conditioning working overtime against thousands of bodies, the faint metallic note of 1,000 watch cases being handled, opened, and set back down. Under all of it, somewhere on that show floor, sharing space with names that have owned this industry since before commercial air travel existed, sits a booth belonging to a company called Barron's. Most people walking past don't know the name. That's the point. Nobody expected them to. 11 brands made their debut at Watches and Wonders this year, the largest first-timer class in the fair's history. 10 came from France, Germany, Japan, and Switzerland. Countries this show has always known how to talk to. Quorum, returning under new ownership. Shin, the German tool watchmaker. Credor, Seiko's most exclusive tier, making its first appearance outside Japan after decades of staying home. Lepay, 1839, the Swiss clockmaker, known for its collaborations with MB and F. The show itself runs a strict schedule. 4 professional days first, industry only, followed by 3 public days where anyone with a ticket, priced at 550 Swiss francs for the premium package, can walk the same floor as the buyers and journalists. Organizers were bracing for nearly 60,000 visitors and more than 6,000 retailers across the week. That's the scale of room a first-time brand has to hold its own inside. One brand came from China. It wasn't invited because it was big. It employs 48 people. It wasn't invited because a conglomerate was backing it. It got in on 5 watches, 1 collaboration with a legendary French independent, and 12 years of work that almost nobody outside a small circle of collectors had been paying attention to. Ask why now? And the easy answer is that a fair is simply opening its doors wider. That answer isn't wrong. It's also not the whole one. We'll come back to the real reason, and it has almost nothing to do with generosity. Behind every first invitation is a longer story about every year they said no. That story starts 12 years earlier, in a city most watch collectors couldn't find on a map. 35 years of no. Watches and Wonders didn't start as Watches and Wonders. In 1991, it was launched as the Salon International de la Haute Horlogerie, SIHH for short. It was a private, trade-only affair with 5 brands in the room: Baume and Mercier, Cartier, Piaget, Gerald Genta, Daniel Roth, 4,500 square meters of floor space, and an invitation list short enough to fit on an index card. For 3.5 decades, that list grew slowly, and it grew in one direction: European houses, almost without exception. The occasional Japanese manufacturer eventually got a seat, and even that took years. Grand Seiko wasn't a fixture for most of the fair's history, and Credor didn't get its own booth until this exact year, after decades of staying inside Japan's borders on purpose. China wasn't on the list. Not because nobody there was making watches. China is the largest watch-producing country on the planet by volume, and has been for years, home to hundreds of thousands of people working in the clock and watch industry. But volume was never what this show measured. It measured a specific kind of legitimacy, the kind built out of centuries, guilds, and family names carved into shopfronts in Geneva and the Vallée de Joux. So for 35 years, a country that assembles more watches than anywhere else on Earth had 0 seats at the one table that decides what counts as serious. Not one. Through booms, through downturns, through the rise of Seagull's in-house tourbillons and Siga Design's GPHG winning skeleton watches and a dozen other Chinese brands building genuine mechanical watchmaking, the door stayed shut. Sit with that for a second, because it isn't really a story about quality. Somewhere in the last decade, the technical gap closed. Chinese manufacturers proved they could cut a balance wheel, finish a movement, build a tourbillon that keeps time as well as anything from the Vallée de Joux. What hadn't closed was the door itself. And a door that stays shut after the argument for opening it has already been won isn't a technical problem anymore. It's a different kind of problem entirely. The fair itself grew up around that exclusivity. SIHH stayed a private, invite-only affair for industry insiders for almost 3 decades before it rebranded as Watches and Wonders in 2020 and finally opened its public days to anyone willing to buy a ticket. By 2026, the guest list had grown from 5 founding brands to 65, an expansion that looks generous until you notice the same year the fair let in its first Chinese independent. It also let a longtime member go. Montblanc, a brand that had exhibited for years, is one of this year's most notable absences. The door into Watches and Wonders never just swings open, it rotates. Somebody new gets pulled in, and somebody else quietly steps out, and nobody frames it that way in the press releases. This year, that changed, and it's worth understanding exactly who walked through first. Somewhere in Shenzhen, a small group of people spent 12 years building the case for exactly why that door should open. Here's who they are. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. The shop in Shenzhen. Barron's started in 2012, founded by a watchmaker named Lin Bingqiang, alongside a small group of co-founders, including Eric So, a watch collector since high school who ran an online watch magazine called Spiral back in 2003. Years before Chinese watchmaking had much of an international audience to write for. They set up shop in Shenzhen, a city built for electronics manufacturing, not heritage watchmaking. The brand name is a tribute, and it was borrowed from Peter Behrens, a German industrial designer from the early 20th century who, among his other work, built a handful of clock towers. A small brand's quiet nod toward a tradition it wasn't born into. They didn't rush. 6 years passed between founding the company and releasing a first commercial watch. 6 years spent on research, in-house tooling, and building an actual design language from nothing. At a moment when most upstart watch brands were slapping a logo onto a stock case and calling it a debut. The patience shows up in the numbers now. Today, Barron's runs a staff of 48, including more than 20 dedicated watchmakers, and produces most of its own components in-house, up through its own sapphire crystals. That's not typical for a brand this young. Most independents, even respected European ones, lean on outside suppliers for major parts. Barron's builds its own case for owning the whole process, literally. Zhu Xunhua, who heads the Shenzhen Watch and Clock Association, has watched that build-up from close range for years. His read on what Barron's presence at the fair actually represents is straightforward. It's proof, to an industry that spent decades assuming otherwise, that Chinese high-end watchmaking has earned genuine global recognition on its own creative and manufacturing merits, not as a discount alternative to something else. Coming from someone who represents the wider Shenzhen watch trade, rather than Barron's itself, that reads less like a promotional line and more like a verdict on an entire regional industry, delivered through one company's booth. By 2020, that process had earned Barron's its first nominations at the Grand Prix d'Horlogerie de Genève, the watch industry's most prestigious award, for pieces called the Apolar and the Rotary, a collaboration with Konstantin Chaikin, the Russian independent watchmaker known for his surreal wristbands and joker dials, followed not long after. Chaikin doesn't lend his name to just anyone. His own watches sell to a small, fiercely loyal collector base that treats his output as a genre unto itself, and a Chinese watchmaker earning his attention was, in its own quiet way, an industry credential most established houses never bother chasing. A second Chaikin collaboration, called the Ace of Hearts, landed in 2025. Separately, back in 2023, the Ultralight 11G, a carbon fiber piece inspired by an ancient Chinese note-taking tool known as a watt, earned a nomination for the Louis Vuitton Watch Prize for Independent Creatives, and has since sold out completely. By 2024, Barron's was the only Chinese watch brand present at Geneva Watch Days, one of the industry's other major fairs, standing alone in a room full of Swiss and European independents, representing an entire country by itself. The years between were not quiet ones. Barron's kept releasing watches nobody else would have attempted. a starship, an interstellar travel piece, and an astronomer, all in 2019. Then a perigee built around its first in-house movement, the BM-1, and a special Starship 2 edition that rode an actual Chinese rocket into space. In 2024 came the Orion 1, a design pulled from science fiction and paired with an invented brand mascot the company calls Alien, and a kung fu watch that leaned all the way into the kind of playfulness most heritage houses would consider beneath them. A Batman-themed piece followed at Geneva Watch Days that same year. None of it reads like a company trying to look serious by imitating Switzerland. It reads like a company that already knew what it wanted to be and was simply waiting for an industry big enough to notice. None of that got them into Watches and Wonders. Not that year, not the year after. That's the part worth pausing on. This wasn't a brand that appeared out of nowhere in 2026 and caught a lucky break. This was a brand that spent over a decade doing the work, earning the nominations, showing up to every adjacent fair that would have them, and still had to wait for the one that mattered most. I'll be honest, that timeline bothers me more than it probably should. Getting good enough was never supposed to be the hard part. Getting invited was. Getting into the room was one battle. What they put inside the booth is the part nobody in Geneva saw coming. What they actually brought. Barons didn't walk into Geneva with a watch that apologized for where it came from. They walked in with 5 new pieces built around a Bronze Age site most of the room had never heard of. The Pupil Ultralight takes its design from Sangxingdui, an archaeological site in Sichuan province discovered in the 1980s, where the ancient Shu civilization left behind bronze artifacts unlike anything else found in China. Among them, eye-shaped objects the Shu people used to represent the connection between the human and the divine, protruding from bronze masks in a way that still reads as strange and modern 3,000 years later. Barons took that shape, known as the Bronze Diamond Eye, and built it directly into the movement. The hour and minute hands are sharp triangles that echo it. So does the layout of the dial itself, angled around the same geometry archaeologists pulled out of the ground in Sichuan 4 decades ago. One version, the Pupil Ultralight 14G, comes in titanium and is priced at $9,200, sold without a production limit. 2 more, limited to 9 pieces each, are built from a material Barons calls lightweight monolayer graphene hybrid, a case construction that gets the whole watch down to 8 grams, lighter than 2 American quarters stacked together, finished in gold leaf on one and platinum leaf on the other. The movement itself, a new manual wind in-house caliber called the BM9, sits integrated directly into the case rather than resting on a separate mainplate, which is how the whole package stays under 5.5 millimeters thick, despite carrying a power reserve indicator, a jumping hour function, and a day-night display. Lin Bingqiang has said, in comments around the launch, that folding Chinese cultural elements into watch design and putting them in front of a global audience carries real meaning for him, personally, beyond the commercial case for doing it. That's a founder's line, and it's fair to read it with some skepticism. But it lines up with 12 years of a company doing exactly that, project after project, long before there was a Geneva booth to put it in front of. This isn't a label borrowing Swiss design vocabulary and swapping in cheaper materials to undercut the price. It's a company reaching 3,000 years into its own country's history and turning what it finds there into a wristwatch nobody in Switzerland could have designed. Because nobody in Switzerland grew up anywhere near Sangxingdui. Then there's the KWH, built in collaboration with Vianney Halter, the French independent watchmaker who spent 4 decades building some of the strangest, most respected mechanical watches in the industry. KWH stands for kilowatt hour. The case is shaped like an old electricity meter, because that's actually where the idea came from. Halter and Lin bonded, of all things, over a shared hobby of collecting vintage electrical meters, and the resulting watch tells time through a patented micro-chain system. A small ruby-bearing chain that moves around the dial link by link, closer to a mechanical pixel snake than a traditional handset. The movement inside packs 870 components. For 2026, 2 new colorways arrived at the show: white ceramic with aqua green detailing and tantalum with a deep blue finish. 90 pieces of each, limited. Earlier gold editions of the same collaboration ran close to $45,000. Which of these would you actually wear, the ancient bronze eye or the electricity meter? Tell me below. That price point matters more than it looks on the surface. This isn't the version of Chinese watchmaking most people picture. Cheap movements stuffed into homage cases, sold in bulk on AliExpress for the price of a nice dinner. It isn't a seagull movement humming inside somebody else's design, either, however respectable that story is in its own right. This is a Chinese independent charging, Swiss independent prices, standing in the same room as Swiss independence, and getting taken seriously for it by the people whose opinions actually move this industry. A watch that expensive, from a brand that unknown, doesn't sell itself at a trade show. It needs somebody willing to stop walking and actually look. The reputation they were actually fighting. To understand what $9,000 means coming from a Chinese brand, it helps to know what "made in China" has meant on a watch dial for most casual buyers. For decades, the words attached to a specific, narrow slice of the market. Mass-market fashion watches selling for $10 to $60. Digital analog hybrids stacked by the thousand on marketplace sites. Movements built for volume rather than character. Real, useful watches. Not the kind anybody expected to see sharing a room with Patek Philippe. That reputation didn't come from nowhere, and it isn't really Barons's problem to solve alone. But it is the water the brand has been swimming in since 2012. Every GPHG nomination, every Chaikin collaboration, every sold-out limited run had to do double duty. Prove the watch was good, and quietly argue against an entire category's reputation at the same time. Barons wasn't really competing with Rolex for space in that Palexpo hall. It was competing with every $15 watch that ever had the word China stamped on its caseback, for the right to be read as something else entirely. That's a harder fight than it sounds like from the outside. And it's one almost no Swiss brand in that building has ever had to fight at all. Fighting a reputation is one thing. Watching somebody actually drop it, mid-stride, on a trade show floor is another. What made this different from the other 10? 10 other brands debuted at Watches and Wonders 2026 alongside Barons, and it's worth being clear about why none of them carry quite the same weight. Corum, returning under new Swiss ownership, is a legacy brand reclaiming old ground. Shin joining is a respected German name finally showing up somewhere it always belonged. Credor's arrival matters, but Credor had already spent decades building unimpeachable credibility inside Japan. Geneva was a formality by comparison, a stage it had already earned elsewhere. Barons is the only name on that list of 11 that had to build its case for legitimacy from a country the industry had never let speak for itself at all. Every other debutante was extending a story the room already knew how to tell. Barons was asking the room to learn an entirely new one, in real time, on the show floor, with 3,000 years of unfamiliar history as its opening argument. That's a different kind of debut, and it's why watch journalists kept circling back to that one small booth all week, long after the headline acts had already been covered twice over. Coverage of Rolex and Patek gets written before the doors even open. Coverage of a 48-person workshop from Shenzhen has to be earned in real time, on the floor, one conversation at a booth at a time. Journalists circling back is one kind of proof. A stranger stopping mid-stride and actually picking the watch up is another kind entirely. The collector who almost didn't stop. Picture the kind of collector who's been doing this for 15 years, not a beginner. Somebody who's owned 3 Rolexes and sold 2 of them, who's spent enough time on forums to have real opinions about micro rotors and finishing quality, who walks a trade show floor with a specific, practiced kind of tunnel vision, beeline for the big names, nod politely at everything else, keep the pace up because there are 65 booths and 1 afternoon. That collector walks past the Baron's booth at first. Small footprint, unfamiliar name, a country they associate, fairly or not, with a very different tier of the market. There's a version of this story where they keep walking straight toward the Audemars Piguet exhibition and never look back. And honestly, most people at that show probably lived that version. A booth this size, tucked among 65 exhibitors competing for the same afternoon, doesn't win attention just by existing, but something catches. Maybe it's the case shape. Maybe it's a friend from a forum group chat, texting to ask if they've seen the pupil yet. They stop, they pick it up, and the thing about picking up an 8-gram watch is that your hand doesn't expect it at all. It's disorienting in a way no spec sheet prepares you for, lighter than the strap holding it. They ask the person at the booth where the design comes from, half expecting the usual answer, Inspired by nature, inspired by architecture, inspired by whatever happens to perform well on social media that quarter. Instead, they get an explanation involving a Bronze Age archaeological dig in Sichuan and a civilization that predates most of what's sitting 3 tables over at the AP booth by 2,000 years. They didn't walk in looking for a history lesson. They got one anyway, engraved into a movement. That's the moment the old story, cheap Chinese watch, and the object actually sitting in their palm stop matching up. Not because this one collector suddenly discovered China makes good watches. Plenty of serious collectors already knew that, quietly, for years. It's that nobody had put a 3,000-year-old archaeological site on a Swiss trade show floor and made the case for it out loud, in the one room that decides what counts. Everything about that booth looks like a story about design. It isn't, really. The actual reason Geneva said yes this year has a number attached to it, and it's not a flattering one for Switzerland. Why the timing isn't an accident. Remember the question from the start. Why now, and not 5 years ago? Here's the number that actually answers it. In 2025, Swiss watch exports to China fell just over 12%, according to the Federation of the Swiss Watch Industry's own year-end report. That's the second consecutive year of decline. Combined, exports to China have dropped by more than a third across those 2 years. Swiss watches as a whole category sold 25.6 billion francs worth of product worldwide in 2025, down for the second straight year, with Asia dragging the total lower almost single-handedly. Employment in the Swiss watch sector fell too, by more than 1%, according to the industry's own Employers Association. That's not a rounding error buried in a footnote. That's an entire regional market the Swiss industry spent 2 decades building its growth on, quietly cutting itself in half. China wasn't alone, either. The same year, new American tariff policy rattled the industry's other major market, forcing brands to front-load shipments and rework pricing on the fly. 2 of the 3 biggest markets a Swiss watch depends on were shaky at once. In the same 12 months, a Chinese independent finally got a booth in Geneva. So, when Watches and Wonders opened its doors to 11 new brands this year, the largest first-timer class it has ever hosted, that wasn't generosity, and it wasn't really about diversity for its own sake, either. A fair that depends on Chinese collectors, Chinese retailers, and Chinese attention doesn't ignore that country's own watchmaking industry forever, not while the very consumers it needs back in the room are the ones watching to see whether their country's own watchmakers ever get a seat at it. There were flickers of recovery elsewhere in the data. Secondary market prices ticked up modestly over the same year, according to tracking firms that watch resale values closely, but that recovery was fragile enough that nobody in Switzerland was treating it as a solved problem. That doesn't make Behrens's watches any less genuine, or the 12 years of work behind them any less earned. But it's worth being honest about what actually opened that door, because the honest version is more interesting than the flattering one. It wasn't only good taste. Good taste had been sitting in Shenzhen for over a decade already, winning GPHG nominations nobody outside the industry noticed. What changed in 2026 wasn't the quality of the work. It was that the industry finally needed a reason to look. There's a version of this where Swiss watchmaking treats that pressure as a threat and closes ranks tighter instead. That's not what happened, at least not this year. The fair chose expansion over defensiveness, which is either a sign of confidence or a sign of necessity, and probably a mix of both. Either way, the door opened on terms nobody had to spell out loud, and Behrens walked through it, regardless of which motive actually mattered most. Once the room actually looked, it didn't stay quiet about what it saw. What the industry is saying now. The reaction from the watch press wasn't polite applause. It was closer to genuine surprise. One outlet covering the show floor compared the brand's bold, oversized casework to Richard Mille, calling it a name most readers hadn't heard yet, but probably should. Another described walking away thoroughly impressed after trying on nearly every piece Behrens brought. A well-regarded independent watch publication put it more bluntly, essentially arguing that even when Behrens's aesthetic doesn't land for a given reviewer personally, the brand functions as close to an ideal standard-bearer for what Chinese watchmaking can be. None of that reads like charity coverage. Watch journalists, especially the ones who cover independence for a living, aren't in the habit of being kind for the sake of it. Their readers can smell a favor from 3 paragraphs away. The coverage Behrens received reads the way coverage reads when a brand actually earns the column inches. Specific, technical, occasionally skeptical, and still fundamentally impressed. And that's a different kind of validation than sales figures or export numbers. Export numbers explain why the door opened. This is what happens once people actually walk through it and start talking. A Chinese independent brand spent over a decade building toward a moment where the watch press stopped writing impressive for a Chinese brand and started just writing impressive, full stop, no qualifier attached. That's a small change in language. It's a much bigger change in what it signals. Barron's wasn't even the only Asian name reshaping the conversation on the show floor that week. Grand Seiko and Credor spent the same fair making a similar argument for Japan, on their own terms, with their own decades of groundwork behind them. Put next to each other, the two stories rhyme. An industry that spent a century deciding what counted as serious watchmaking was, in the same 7 days, forced to expand that definition twice. Have you seen a Barron's watch in person, or is this the first time you're hearing the name? None of this means the doors are all open now. It means one very specific door is, and that changes more than it looks like it should. What this actually changes. None of this means Barron's is about to outsell Rolex, or that Swiss watchmaking is somehow in trouble because one Shenzhen workshop got a booth in Geneva. That's not the claim here, and it wouldn't be an honest one to make. What it does mean is smaller and stranger, and probably more permanent than a single trade show headline. For 35 years, the biggest stage in watchmaking operated on an unspoken assumption. Legitimacy came from one direction, and it had a Swiss postal code. That assumption didn't survive April 2026. Not because anyone stood up and announced its death, because a graphene watch shaped around a 3,000-year-old bronze eye sat 2 rows down from a Patek Philippe display case. And the room didn't fall apart. Visitors kept walking the floor all week, and not one article from those 7 days describes anyone treating the Barron's booth as a novelty act. Every Chinese label that applies to exhibit next year does so knowing the door has already opened once, for a company with 48 employees and no conglomerate behind it. Every young designer in Shenzhen or Beijing building something entirely original, instead of copying a Datejust and hoping nobody minds, now has a real, recent, undeniable example of what happens when you spend over a decade doing the work instead of shortcutting it. That outlasts any single trade show. It isn't really about the watches themselves. It's about the fact that the path from ignored to invited now visibly exists, with a date attached to it, and a name people can look up. And the collector who almost didn't stop, who felt an 8-gram case land wrong in the hand and stayed anyway, they're not an isolated moment either. They're the shape of what happens next, multiplied by however many people walk that same floor next April and decide, this time, to stop. Do you think more Chinese independents get invited next year? Watch what happens at Watches and Wonders 2027 closely. If Barron's is the only Chinese name on next year's list too, that tells you 2026 was a one-time gesture, carefully managed and unlikely to repeat. If 2 or 3 more names show up instead, that tells you something structural actually shifted, and the fair simply found the nerve to admit it in public first. Whatever happens next April, the footage and the photographs from this one already exist. A small booth on a crowded floor, a graphene case shaped around a Bronze Age eye, a collector's hand registering the wrong weight and staying anyway. 35 years of no answered, on the record, in a hall built for exactly this kind of moment. The brands people remember from a show like this were never the ones with the biggest booth. They're the ones that make you rewrite what you thought was possible in the room standing next to them. Barron's didn't need 35 years of institutional history to earn its seat. It needed 12 years, 5 watches, and 1 door somebody was finally, honestly ready to open. So the interesting question was never really whether a Chinese brand could build a watch good enough for Geneva. That question got answered years ago, quietly, in GPHG nomination lists nobody outside the industry read. The real question was whether the industry would ever admit it out loud. This April, in Geneva, it finally did.